He had wealth, power, and control, until his heart gave out on a crowded street. Everyone walked past, except 3 little boys who didn't even know his name. Jason West was a man who lived by schedules. His days were measured in seconds, not minutes. He woke up each morning at 5:45 a.m. sharp, exercised for exactly 30 minutes, reviewed global financial reports over black coffee, and stepped out of his penthouse apartment by 7:30 a.m. without fail. His driver would be waiting in front of the building, briefcase in hand, phone already connected to the car's speaker system so Jason could begin the first of many high-stakes calls before even reaching his downtown office. He was the founder and CEO of West Tech Industries, a global tech empire with influence that stretched across continents. Some called him a visionary. Others, a machine. Either way, no one ever saw him slip, not once. That morning was no different, at least on the surface. The air was crisp, the sun sharp against the skyline, and Jason was dressed in a flawless navy blue suit, the tie knotted perfectly beneath his collar. His assistant had rescheduled a minor investor call, freeing up an unexpected 15-minute window, so for the first time in months, Jason decided to walk the last few blocks to his building. It felt strange but welcome, to be just another face in the crowd, no tinted glass between him and the world. He passed the usual rush of commuters, their faces buried in phones or hunched over coffee cups. Street vendors called out from corners, and the occasional cab honked impatiently in the distance. Jason didn't pay much attention. His mind was already moving through the day ahead, project launches, performance reviews, a potential acquisition on the table. He was calculating numbers, risks, timelines. He was completely in control. Then, without warning, it hit him. A sudden, tight pressure gripped the center of his chest. It wasn't the kind of discomfort he'd experienced from stress or exhaustion, it was deeper, sharper, more final. At first he thought it might pass, just a strange spasm, a muscle clenching the wrong way. But the pain intensified quickly, radiating down his left arm and into his back. His breath shortened. His vision blurred at the edges. He stopped walking and reached for the nearest structure, a bench just outside a sleek office plaza. His hand trembled as he clutched his chest. The leather handle of his briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the pavement with a dull thud. His knees buckled slightly, and he sank onto the bench, forcing himself to stay upright, his other hand gripping the metal edge of the seat for balance. People passed. Dozens of them. Some looked at him briefly, confused perhaps by the sight of a well-dressed man in clear distress, but no one stopped. A few slowed for half a step, then continued on. Jason tried to lift his head, tried to speak, to ask for help, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. He tasted metal and felt sweat pooling beneath his shirt collar. Minutes passed. He wasn't sure how many. The pain was now a weight, unbearable and cold, crushing his chest with every second. He felt the terrifying possibility that he might collapse right there, surrounded by strangers who would keep walking, who would never know his name or what he had built. In that moment, all his wealth, power, and reputation meant nothing. He was just a man struggling to breathe on a public bench, invisible in the noise of the city. And still, no one came. Just as the world around him began to blur into a haze of color and sound, Jason heard something that didn't belong to the usual city noise. It wasn't the harsh rhythm of traffic or the sharp echo of hurried footsteps. It was softer, higher-pitched. A child's voice, curious and a little breathless. Then another. And a third. The words took a moment to register, but when they did, they cut through the fog in his brain like sunlight piercing cloud cover. "Mister, are you okay?" one of them asked. Jason opened his eyes with effort and turned his head slightly toward the sound. Standing in front of him were 3 small boys, triplets, by the look of them, no older than 6. They had the same mop of shaggy brown hair, deep brown eyes, and round faces, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. They weren't dressed in uniforms or expensive clothes. Their t-shirts were plain but colorful, one red, one green, one yellow, and their jeans were slightly faded at the knees. Dirt smudged the tops of their sneakers, and their matching backpacks hung crookedly on small shoulders. Jason tried to speak again, but all he could manage was a whisper, "I'm not. I don't feel well." The boy in the green shirt immediately turned to his brother and said, "Call 911. Right now." The one in yellow nodded and pulled a battered old smartphone from his pocket. The screen cracked at the corner. With surprising focus, he tapped in the number and spoke clearly to the dispatcher. "There's a man sitting on a bench. He's holding his chest and he looks really sick. Please come fast. We're at West Plaza, by the big glass building." Meanwhile, the boy in red reached into his backpack and pulled out a half-folded hoodie, which he rolled up and placed gently behind Jason's back to prop him up. The one in green took his hand, gripping it firmly, and said, "It's okay, mister. We're not leaving." Jason's heart was still pounding painfully in his chest, but for the first time since the attack began, he felt something shift, not in his body, but in the world around him. The sharp edge of panic dulled slightly, replaced by the strange comfort of three small voices talking softly, arguing about whether someone should get water or wait with him. Their presence was like a tether, holding him in place while his body tried to fall apart. People finally began to notice. A woman with a shopping bag stopped nearby, eyes wide, then pulled out her own phone. A man in a business suit slowed down and bent over to ask if help was on the way. The boys nodded together. "We already called," said the one in yellow. "They're coming. We promised we'd stay until they do." It wasn't long before the wail of sirens approached. Jason could hear them, faint at first, then louder, growing sharper with every second. An ambulance pulled up to the curb and medics rushed out with a stretcher. They moved quickly, checking vitals, attaching sensors, stabilizing him. As they worked, one of the paramedics glanced down at the boys and asked, "You kids the ones who called?" All three nodded proudly. "We found him," the green-shirt boy said. "He looked like he needed help." "You probably saved his life," the medic replied. "Good job." Jason was too weak to speak, but his eyes welled up with something heavier than just physical pain. Gratitude. Amazement. Something wordless but overwhelming. As they lifted him onto the stretcher and wheeled him toward the ambulance, he looked back. The boys were still standing there, waving with small hands, their expressions bright but calm. They didn't look afraid. They looked like they had done exactly what they were supposed to. The doors of the ambulance closed. Jason's last glimpse was of three little figures standing against the backdrop of the city, sunlight catching in their hair, their colored shirts like signals against the gray sidewalk. He didn't know their names. He didn't know where they came from. But he knew one thing with total certainty as the ambulance pulled away into traffic. They had saved his life. The hospital room was quiet, save for the occasional beeping of machines and the distant shuffle of nurses moving down the hallway. Jason lay still, his body heavy with exhaustion, though his mind was beginning to stir back to life. He had spent the first 2 days in a fog of medication, doctors monitoring his vitals closely, speaking to him in calm, reassuring voices. Now, as the haze lifted and reality returned, so did the questions. Not just about his health, but about what had happened before the ambulance, before the emergency room, before the IVs and sterile walls. He remembered the pain, yes, that crushing, paralyzing pain in his chest that had made him believe, for a terrifying moment, that he was dying. But more than that, he remembered the boys. 3 of them. Brown eyes. Brown hair. Shirts like traffic lights. Red, green, yellow. They had appeared like a miracle out of the crowd, and in the chaos and fear of that moment, they had been the only ones who saw him not as a businessman or a stranger in a suit, but simply as a person in need. He remembered the way one of them held his hand. The way another had used a hoodie to cushion his back. The calm voice on the phone saying, "Please come fast." Their names, though, those he didn't know. Their voices were still ringing in his mind, but he had no way to find them. Not yet. As soon as he had the strength to sit up, Jason asked the nurse if anyone had identified the children who helped him. She didn't know. She promised to check with the paramedics. A day passed. Then another. Nothing. That lack of resolution gnawed at him more than the pain in his ribs. He didn't just want to thank them. He needed to. Something about those boys had reached him in a place deeper than he could explain, a place untouched by boardrooms and stock portfolios. They had changed something in him, and he couldn't let them vanish into the blur of the city like ghosts from a dream. On the third day, still wearing a hospital gown and a loose pair of slippers, Jason called his assistant from the hospital bed. He asked her to obtain the security footage from the area near the West Plaza bench where he collapsed. He also asked her to work with the local police and emergency dispatch to trace the 911 call made that morning. His assistant hesitated at first. After all, she was used to organizing jet travel and corporate takeovers, not playing detective, but when Jason repeated the request, she heard something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Vulnerability. She got to work immediately. Within a week, they had something. The footage was grainy and the audio was poor, but there was enough to confirm what Jason remembered. There he was, dressed immaculately, stumbling toward the bench. There were the boys, approaching with concern, one of them dialing his phone. And then, a match, dispatch was able to trace the call to a prepaid mobile registered under a woman named Marie Flint. The address was listed in a low-income housing complex across the river, in a neighborhood Jason had only ever driven past, never through. He stared at the report in silence, the printout shaking slightly in his hand. Marie Flint. The name meant nothing to him, and yet it meant everything. He wondered what kind of life these boys came from, what kind of woman had raised them to stop and help when no one else had even paused. A billionaire had nearly died on the street, and the only people who noticed were children from a part of the city people like Jason usually tried not to see. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Jason checked himself out of the hospital against the doctor's cautious advice. He wasn't reckless about it, he promised to rest, take his medication, and avoid stress, but there was something inside him that couldn't wait. He needed to see those boys. He needed to look into their eyes again, this time not from a stretcher, but as a man standing on his own 2 feet. Not as the CEO of West Tech, but as Jason West, the man whose life they had saved. He arrived at the Flint family's apartment building just after noon. It was an aging brick complex with narrow stairwells and chipped paint, laundry lines strung between balconies. The elevator was out of service. He climbed the 3 flights slowly, hand on the railing, pausing at each landing to catch his breath. When he finally reached the apartment door, he hesitated. His heart, still healing, beat a little faster, not from strain, but anticipation. He raised his hand and knocked. A moment passed. Then the door creaked open, and a small boy with bright brown eyes and a red t-shirt stood staring up at him. Jason smiled gently. "Are you one of the boys who helped me?" The boy nodded slowly. "You're the man from the bench." "Yes," Jason said quietly. "And I came to say thank you." The boy in the red t-shirt didn't move right away. He just stood in the doorway, barefoot on the worn linoleum floor, his fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet, cautious curiosity that children learn early when growing up in a world where strangers at the door usually mean trouble. Jason stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, not wanting to overwhelm or frighten him. After a moment, another small voice called from inside the apartment, likely one of the other brothers, and the boy turned his head and yelled, "It's him. The man." Within seconds, the other 2 boys appeared, identical in build and face, but wearing different colored shirts, just like he remembered. They approached the door with wide smiles and unfiltered excitement, their earlier caution replaced with recognition. One of them blurted out, "You didn't die." Not as a joke, but with the genuine relief of someone who had been worried and hadn't known what happened after the ambulance drove away. Jason chuckled softly, both amused and deeply moved by the sincerity of the greeting. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed behind the boys. A woman appeared in the doorway, pushing the kids gently aside with one arm while wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked about 35, maybe younger, but there was a tiredness in her face that made it hard to tell. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose braid, and her eyes, a deeper shade of the boy's brown, were sharp and assessing. Her voice was guarded when she spoke. "Can I help you?" Jason introduced himself calmly. "My name is Jason West. I believe your sons saved my life last week." He paused, studying her expression. "I've been trying to find you. I just wanted to thank them, and you." For a second, her features didn't change. Then a flicker of recognition passed across her face. She glanced down at the boys, who were now practically vibrating with pride. "He's the one," whispered the boy in green. "The one we told you about." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was small and modest, 2 rooms separated by a thin curtain and a kitchenette where something was still simmering on the stove. The walls were decorated with school drawings, taped up at uneven angles. The furniture was mismatched but clean. Jason took it all in silently. This wasn't a place for show or comfort, it was a place that worked hard to hold a family together. He sat on the edge of a fraying armchair while the boys clustered around him on the floor. Marie introduced herself with a quiet nod and asked if he wanted tea. He declined politely, still unsure if he was intruding too far into their lives. But she poured a cup anyway and handed it to him with a kind of gentle stubbornness that made it clear she wasn't asking. He accepted it with a grateful smile. They talked for a while, awkward at first. Jason shared a few details about what had happened after the boys called 911, the hospital, the diagnosis, the doctor's words. "If your sons hadn't acted so quickly," he said, looking directly at Marie, "I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now." Her expression shifted, still composed, but something behind her eyes cracked slightly. She nodded, pressing her lips together. "They've always been good boys," she said softly. "I try to teach them that just because we don't have much doesn't mean we don't have something to give." That line stayed with him. He asked about their lives, and the story unfolded slowly. She had been raising them on her own since they were toddlers. Their father had left without explanation one winter and never returned. Marie worked nights cleaning offices and spent her days picking up extra shifts at a nearby diner. They didn't have much, she said, but the boys never went hungry, and they were learning to be kind, even when life wasn't. She said it without bitterness, just with quiet, honest strength. Jason listened more than he spoke, which wasn't something he was used to. In boardrooms and strategy meetings, he had always been the one talking, giving direction, controlling outcomes. But here, in this small apartment filled with noise and warmth and humility, he realized that his words weren't the most important part. Listening, truly listening, was what mattered now. The boys began to grow comfortable around him. They showed him their toy cars, a homemade comic book, a paper robot made of folded packaging cardboard. Jason watched with genuine interest, not out of politeness but because he was drawn in. Their creativity, their laughter, their openness, it was like stepping into a world that functioned by a different kind of logic, one untouched by quarterly reports and market shares. Before he left, he turned to Marie. "I want to do something for them. For all of you. I know I can't repay what they gave me, but I'd like to try in any way I can." She hesitated. Her instinct was to decline. He saw it in the way her lips parted slightly, in the way her eyes narrowed just enough. Pride. Dignity. But then she looked at her boys, at the way they smiled at Jason like he was some kind of superhero, and her expression softened. Maybe, she said, you could come back sometime. Not with gifts. Just, to visit. Jason nodded, feeling something unspoken settle between them. I'd like that. Very much. Jason began visiting the Flint family regularly, and over time, what started as a gesture of gratitude grew into something deeper, something that surprised even him. At first, he brought small things, books for the boys, groceries, a new backpack to replace the one that had been patched too many times. Marie had been hesitant, always thanking him politely but never quite letting go of the feeling that she was accepting more than she should. Jason noticed this, and one afternoon, he came without gifts. He sat with her on the front steps of their apartment building, watching the boys chase each other around the narrow courtyard, and he said, "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm just, here." From that day on, Marie stopped trying to refuse what he brought, and he stopped trying to impress her with what he gave. Instead, he gave his time. Jason had never truly known what that meant before. His time had always been something rationed, monetized, scheduled to the second. Now, he was spending hours helping the boys with schoolwork, playing card games at their chipped kitchen table, walking with Marie to the laundromat while they talked about life. He began to see the world from a perspective he'd never understood before, not just through Marie's eyes, but through the details of her day-to-day existence. The constant calculations, how to stretch groceries for another 3 days, how to decide between paying a bill or replacing shoes that were 2 sizes too small. There was no self-pity in her stories. Just fact. Just survival. And it humbled him in a way no business failure ever had. The boys, Bruno, Sam, and Trevor, opened up to him completely. They told him about their dreams, their fears, their arguments over who got to pick the bedtime story. They asked questions he didn't always know how to answer. Why did their dad leave? Why were some people rich and others poor? Why did no one else stop to help that day? Jason never pretended to have perfect answers, but he gave them what he could: honesty, thoughtfulness, and the kind of presence that children instinctively recognize as safe. Marie began to trust him in ways that were less visible, but more meaningful. She started leaving the boys with him when she had to run errands or cover an extra shift. She let him help with doctor's appointments and school meetings. One day, after he drove her home from a late-night shift, she didn't invite him in, but she stood at the door for a long time and said, "I never thought someone like you would care about someone like us." Jason didn't know how to respond to that, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't explain how much he had come to rely on them, too. They had filled a space in him he hadn't realized was empty. At work, people noticed the changes. Jason was still CEO, still sharp, but something in his approach had shifted. He started arriving later, leaving earlier. He spoke less in meetings, listened more. He created a company initiative to support families of frontline workers and single parents. When asked why, he simply said, "Because we can. And because we should." Some board members raised eyebrows. Others followed his lead. Investors didn't flee. In fact, they respected him more. It turned out that integrity and empathy weren't liabilities, they were leadership. But even as he built programs and shifted company culture, what mattered most to him wasn't the headlines or the public praise. It was seeing the boys run to him at the sound of his car pulling up. It was the way Marie began smiling more, laughing even, especially on days when things were hard. It was in the quiet moments, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, or reading aloud while the boys curled up beside him, that he found something he'd never felt before. Not success. Not pride. Something closer to peace. One evening, after helping the boys with a school project about heroes, Jason stood at the window with Marie while the kids were brushing their teeth. They looked out over the city, the lights blinking steadily like distant stars. Jason asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you think people can really change?" Marie didn't look at him right away. She watched her son's reflections in the glass and said, "I think people remember who they were supposed to be. Sometimes it just takes something, or someone, to remind them. Jason didn't say anything. But in that moment, he understood exactly what she meant. And deep down, he knew, he wasn't just remembering who he was supposed to be. He was becoming it. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the world Jason thought he had left behind suddenly came crashing through the door he had carefully closed. He was in the middle of organizing a breakfast table with the boys, slicing fruit, pouring cereal, and laughing as Bruno tried to sneak a marshmallow into his oatmeal, when his phone, long forgotten in the other room, began to buzz relentlessly. At first, he ignored it. But the buzzing didn't stop. 5 calls. 10. Then 15. His stomach tightened. He stepped away and checked the screen. It was his assistant, followed by 2 board members and a news editor he hadn't spoken to in years. Then came the messages, urgent, shocking, filled with phrases like leak, video, and corporate betrayal. His hands tensed as he tapped the first link sent to him. A grainy video loaded. The audio wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. In it, his former COO and longtime colleague, Martin Graham, was seated at an upscale bar with another executive Jason had once trusted implicitly. Their voices were low, but distinct. They were discussing how to exploit Jason's reduced involvement in the company. Joking about how his charity phase had made him predictable. Then came the words that stopped Jason cold: the board will eat it up. We frame it right, get him to sign off on the wrong deal, and when he's out of the picture, we clean up. They were planning to remove him. Quietly. Ruthlessly. They had been working in the background, biding their time, using his softened public image and charitable focus as a mask for their ambitions. And now the proof had gone public. The video had been leaked anonymously, already trending on news sites, with headlines asking whether Jason West had lost control of his own empire. He stood in the middle of Marie's kitchen, phone in hand, the light from the window painting sharp lines across the floor. The noise of the boys behind him faded as the weight of betrayal settled on his shoulders. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. He had once trusted these men. He had built his company with them, defended them, believed in them. And now they had waited until he became vulnerable, until he chose humanity over profit, to try to rip it away. Marie entered the room quietly, immediately sensing something was wrong. She looked at Jason's face and didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She simply placed a hand on his arm and said, "Whatever it is, you're not alone in it." Those words struck deeper than any accusation in the video. Jason looked at her, truly looked at her, and then back at the kitchen where the boys were sitting, swinging their legs, watching him now with concern. He realized he was standing at a crossroads again, not between power and weakness, but between reaction and purpose. He could storm back into the corporate world, demand resignations, fight with fire. Or he could do something harder. He could respond with integrity. He made a few calls. First to his legal team. Then to the PR department. He asked for every document, every contract Martin had touched in the past year. He requested a private internal audit and made it clear, no media statements, no drama, just facts. Just truth. He wasn't going to play their game. He was going to dismantle it. Within 48 hours, the investigation revealed more than Jason expected. Financial manipulations, hidden agendas, and a network of deals designed to push him aside under the guise of evolution. Jason quietly called an emergency board meeting. He walked in not as the softened man they had hoped to outmaneuver, but as a leader who had rediscovered his spine. He presented the facts. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the evidence, one page at a time, while the room sat in heavy silence. By the end of the presentation, 3 board members had resigned. Martin was removed immediately. Jason did not celebrate. There was nothing victorious about cleaning up betrayal. But he felt something settle, balance restored, not through vengeance, but through courage. Later that evening, back at Marie's apartment, Jason sat at the kitchen table, watching the boys draw superheroes on construction paper. Sam handed him one of the drawings. "It's you," he said proudly. Jason looked at it and saw a figure in a blue suit, not with a cape, but with 3 small kids standing beside him and a big red heart drawn on his chest. Jason smiled, eyes stinging slightly. He realized the heart wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was everything that had kept him strong. Spring arrived slowly, but with purpose. It crept into the city one breeze at a time, softening the edges of cold mornings and turning patches of gray into hopeful bursts of green. The streets became livelier, the air lighter, and for Jason, every sunrise felt a little warmer than the one before. The weight he had carried through winter, of betrayal, exhaustion, uncertainty, had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It no longer sat on his chest like a stone. It had settled more deeply, turning into something solid, something instructive. He had been tested, and what remained now was a version of himself he didn't recognize from his former life, but one he liked more. He had returned to his role at the company with a new clarity. Not to reclaim power for the sake of pride, but to steer it forward with responsibility. His leadership became quieter, more measured, grounded in empathy rather than dominance. He established new ethical standards, implemented mentorship programs, expanded support for employees with families, and poured funding into community outreach. But the most ambitious project he launched was called the First Hands Initiative, named in honor of the 3 little boys who had been the first to reach out when no one else had. It was a program designed to teach emergency first aid, emotional intelligence, and practical life skills to children in underserved neighborhoods. It wasn't just about saving lives, it was about teaching children that their compassion could be powerful. Jason personally visited the pilot schools where the program began. He stood in classrooms where crayons and courage coexisted, watched kids role-play emergency calls and practice CPR on training dummies. Every time he spoke to them, he began the same way: "You don't need to be big to be brave." It became a phrase children repeated like a chant, scribbled into notebooks, posted on walls, carried home like a secret badge of honor. Meanwhile, his connection to the Flint family deepened. He no longer felt like a visitor. He was simply part of the rhythm of their life. He helped the boys with school science projects, made pancakes with too much syrup on Saturdays, and learned which cartoons to laugh at even when he didn't understand them. Marie trusted him fully now. The way she looked at him had changed, not with hesitation, but with a quiet intimacy that needed no explanation. Sometimes, in the evenings, they sat outside the apartment on the old fire escape, not speaking much, just watching the sky change. It became their ritual, their way of exhaling the day. One particular afternoon, the boys were in the living room building a blanket fort that spanned most of the furniture. Jason sat on the floor, helping them tie the corners of sheets to chairs, when Sam suddenly asked, "Are you ever gonna marry our mom?" Jason froze, a pillow in his hand mid-toss. He turned slowly to see 3 sets of brown eyes fixed on him with such sincerity that it made him laugh. "Why do you ask that?" he said carefully, buying time. Bruno shrugged. "You're here all the time. You're kind. You help. You make her smile when she's tired." Trevor added, "That's like love, right?" Jason didn't answer right away. But he didn't deflect either. "That is like love," he finally said, gently. "And I love all of you. Very much." That night, long after the boys had fallen asleep and the fort had collapsed into a soft mess of blankets, Jason stood in the kitchen with Marie. She had been reading, barefoot and tired, her hair pulled up in a loose knot. He watched her quietly for a long moment. She looked up from her book and smiled. "What is it?" she asked. He stepped forward slowly, pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and set it on the table. "I didn't plan a speech," he said. "And this isn't about grand gestures. But I've lived long enough to know when something is real. I don't want to keep visiting a life that already feels like home. I want to live it. With you. With them. If you'll have me. Marie was quiet for a long breath, then another. Her eyes began to shimmer. She looked down at the ring, not extravagant, but thoughtful. A single, small diamond flanked by 3 tiny stones, like 3 small lights shining on either side of something constant. You know what the boys asked me last week, she whispered. If we could keep you. Jason smiled, his heart full and raw all at once. Then I guess this is me asking if I can stay. Marie reached for his hand, her fingers warm and sure, and she nodded. Yes. You already have. The wedding wasn't grand. There were no chandeliers, no velvet-lined invitations or sweeping orchestras playing custom scores. It took place in a small park just a few blocks from where Jason had once collapsed, the very place where 3 little boys had spotted him on a bench and unknowingly rewrote the course of his life. They chose the spot intentionally, not out of sentimentality, but because it held truth, because sometimes the most sacred places are the ones where pain met compassion and something beautiful began. A few folding chairs, strings of paper lanterns hanging from the trees, and a makeshift wooden arch that Bruno, Sam, and Trevor insisted on painting themselves. It was all simple, and it was perfect. Marie wore a soft, cream-colored dress that swayed in the breeze and made her look like a page from a book Jason had once been too busy to read. Her smile was quiet, almost private, as if she were still trying to convince herself that this moment, this joy, belonged to her. Jason wore a light gray suit, no tie, sleeves rolled just above his wrists. The boys stood between them, dressed in white shirts with suspenders, shoes too new and slightly too big, grinning with a kind of pride that made everyone watching smile back without meaning to. The ceremony was short, not because they wanted it that way, but because they didn't need to say much. They had already lived the vows long before they were spoken aloud. When Jason promised to choose Marie every day, not because life was easy but because she was worth it, she didn't cry. She only reached for his hand and held it like she never intended to let go. And when she promised to build a life with him, one that included not just love, but safety, laughter, and second chances, Jason felt the echo of that promise settle into the deepest part of his chest. It wasn't dramatic, but it was final, in the best way. After the ceremony, the boys pulled him aside and gave him a gift. It was a scrapbook they had made, some pages filled with drawings, others with printed pictures of them together, trips to the museum, pancakes in the kitchen, a blurry shot of Jason falling asleep with a book on the couch while one of them used his shoulder as a pillow. On the last page was a drawing. 4 figures, 3 boys and a tall man in the middle, holding their hands. Above it, they had written, in blocky handwriting, "Our family." Finally. Jason couldn't speak for a moment. He just hugged them all at once, awkward and clumsy, holding too tight and not nearly long enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur of sunlight, dancing on the grass, paper cups filled with lemonade, and laughter that felt like music. No one talked about business, or stocks, or quarterly goals. Instead, they told stories. Neighbors, co-workers, people from the community who had seen what Jason had become, not just the man in the headlines, but the one who showed up with groceries, who stayed after meetings to ask about someone's mother in the hospital, who kneeled on the classroom floor to tie a student's shoe. He had changed, and because of him, other things had changed too. As the sun set, casting long golden shadows across the park, Jason stood with Marie beside the old bench where everything had started. It was still there, weathered and chipped, but now it held new meaning. He touched the metal backrest lightly and whispered something she couldn't quite hear. She didn't ask him to repeat it. She just leaned into him and said, "I'm glad you sat down that day." Jason smiled, turning toward her, and replied, "I'm glad someone saw me." Months passed, then years, and life took on the shape of something real and steady. The boys grew, slowly and then all at once, from wide-eyed children into young men who still called him Dad without hesitation. Marie returned to painting and began teaching art workshops in the community. Jason eventually stepped down from his position as CEO and chose instead to focus full-time on the First Hands initiative, which had now expanded to dozens of cities across the country. They moved into a home just outside the city, a modest house with creaking floorboards, a sunroom full of plants, and a kitchen that always smelled like something warm was waiting. The front door never stayed closed for long. Friends, neighbors, and former students came in and out freely. There was always someone at the table, always a story being shared. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Jason collapsed, they returned to that same park. They brought flowers. They sat on the bench. And they remembered not just what almost ended, but what began. Jason often said he hadn't been saved by medicine or machines, but by 3 small hands that reached out when no one else did. He lived the rest of his days honoring that truth. Not with speeches. Not with monuments. But by choosing, every single day, to be the kind of man worth saving. This story, at its core, isn't about a millionaire or a heart attack. It's about what happens when the world slows down just enough for someone to truly see another person. Jason's collapse wasn't just physical, it was emotional, moral, human. He fell not only because of a failing heart, but because the life he had built was missing the very thing that makes life worth living: connection. The ending is powerful not because it's dramatic, but because it's deeply human. The boys didn't save Jason with money, status, or strategy. They saved him with instinctive kindness, something pure, uncalculated, and freely given. That one act unraveled everything Jason thought he knew and rebuilt it into something stronger, something real. What makes this story unforgettable is that it flips the power dynamic. The children, the ones society often overlooks, are the heroes. And Jason, the man on top of the world, is the one who needed saving. That reversal is humbling, and necessary. It reminds us that dignity and courage don't come from wealth or position, but from compassion, from the smallest choices in unexpected moments. The beauty of the ending isn't that Jason finds a new family or purpose, it's that he earns it. Not with money, but with presence, humility, and love. He becomes a man worthy of the second chance life, and 3 little boys gave him. That's not just a happy ending. That's a meaningful one.